Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to, or even good morning, and welcome to episode 37 of International Expansion Explained. My guest today is Art Dicker, and we're going to be talking about the China risk equation, which could also probably go under the subtitle of what could possibly go wrong. And in China, that tends to be quite a lot of things. So Art he's practiced at a lot of major law firms, and he's also worked as an in-house counsel for over 18 years. And I think you've spent over 10 years in China, right? So
Yeah, 16, but
16
who's
years in
counting?
China,
Yeah.
okay. And he's advised a lot of tech companies on mergers and acquisitions, venture capital, and of course, all of the kind of joint ventures, licensing, distribution stuff that comes up with China business, but also day-to-day advice on employment law, IP. I think IP was the topic that I originally came across your content on LinkedIn when we very first met a few years ago. So, very experienced legal guy, both in the US and in China. So, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Yeah, thank you, Kathryn. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and maybe I'm not sure if there's anybody who's listening live already on LinkedIn. If you are, maybe you can drop us a hi in the comments just so that we know that we are actually properly live. It looks as if everything is running properly. Yes, but it's always good to have that confirmation. So, maybe you could start off by giving us a quick rundown. How did you get into international business, and especially the China piece? Because I would say that it's not kind of the typical career route, is it necessarily?
Yeah, absolutely. I studied Chinese back in college. I knew I wanted to study something international. Just was always interested in that as a kid growing up. I picked Chinese back in the late 90s to learn because, there was talk about China joining the WTO, and it was clear, like even in the late 90s, that China was going to be a growing economy and important. So I liked what I knew about the culture, and also was kind of a practical choice. And then after I studied Chinese in college, I went to law school, and then I worked in New York a couple years. But then I had the opportunity to go from New York to Beijing, and that was great. I had forgotten a lot of the Chinese. I was losing it, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, all this time I spent, and would it be kind of a tragedy if I just kind of slipped away?" So I got to combine the two things together, law and Chinese, and was a great time in Beijing, 2007,
Oh
leading
yeah,
up to the Olympics there. It was a great time to be in Beijing, and a lot of companies were in. China was growing at like 13% a year, and Apple was just pouring money into China, and it was the good old days, I guess, in some ways. And then after that, I did that for about 4.5 years, and then I had the itch to go onto more the business side. So I went to a client of the firm. The firm was Morrison Forster. I went to a client called Cadence Design Systems to be their Asia Pacific General Counsel. Cadence is a software for semiconductor design,
yeah.
and was there for 6 years. I had no idea what they did before I joined, but I had learned it quickly. And so, yeah, and then came back out after 6 years. That brought me down to Shanghai. Came out after 6 years to go back to private practice again, which I did at a firm called R&P in Shanghai. And then 2.5 years ago, I moved back to the U.S. here to San Diego, where I'm at today. And now I just, as you said, I do a lot of cross-border work. I have my own firm called Parkman Legal, and it's still doing a lot of cross-border work, including more and more in the direction from China to the U.S.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be an interesting, let's say the next few years are going to be very interesting, especially in the tech space, where I guess you have some connections from the cadence time and all the kind of semiconductor issues. It's certainly a hot topic.
Oh, it is. I mean, when I joined Cadence, again, I didn't know what they did. I don't think most people would have even heard of the company. But just this year, just to show how things have changed, just this year, for a brief period, I think a month or two ago, Cadence was forbidden from selling any of its products to China. because semiconductor is now a very contentious space, and the software is very critical for designing chips. So it's back, but that was it just shows how things are touch and go at the moment.
Yeah. And I mean, that was more or less the same kind of time. 2008 was also when my China journey started. Mine started, unfortunately, with the melamine scandal because I was in infant formula. So,
Yeah.
that was how I came to spend rather a lot of time in China, although I never had actually a residential permit, never kind of officially lived there, but it's often felt like I was just commuting between Europe and China. So, I mean, we've touched a little bit on the present issues that there are, but realistically speaking, the topic of China and risk has been a hot topic for a long time, and it's one of those questions where I feel like a lot of companies, they're either really paranoid about the level of risk that they might have in China to the point that it paralyzes them and they don't want to do anything at all, or they have this very kind of cavalier attitude of, it'll be fine, what could go wrong? And of course, in China, anything that can go wrong often does go wrong. So maybe at a high level, when a company is looking to expand into the Chinese market, what are the main types of risks that they should be analyzing before they actually even make any concrete moves?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you're right. There is kind of like a spectrum of, on the one hand, people who are paranoid, and on the other hand, people who kind of deliberately have their head in the sand and think that everything will be fine. And the truth is somewhere in between, right? I think where they start is, of course, it's gets somewhat obvious. Find the right partners to work with, right? Go in light. Generally, a general approach is, when you're investing in China, whether it's from the amount of people you plan to hire, or whether it's how much capital you want to put in, go kind of at a step-by-step approach, because as we'll probably get into later on, both of those things are hard to undo, right? Putting in capital, China has a thing called registered capital, which is slightly different from the way it works in most other countries. But you put that capital in, you sign up for a commitment, how much capital you're going to put in. And it used to be back in the day that it was very lax as to whether you actually ultimately put that in or not. These days, there's a much stricter, I believe it's a 5-year timeline you have to put it in. And when you put it in, it's in. It's very hard to get it out. So a lot of companies these days, more than before, are pulling back on their operations and winding them down, and they're finding that it's very difficult to get capital out. So that's one thing to be aware of upfront, is how much capital you put in and how much you sign up to put in, because someone may tell you, oh, don't worry about that, but that's changing these days. So that's one thing. And then the people that you hire, again, it's very hard to terminate people, as I'm sure we're going to talk about later in the program. So be careful who you hire and how many people you hire, because it's not like the U.S., for example, especially coming from the U.S., which is a at-will system where you basically need to do, absent outright racial or gender discrimination or something like that, you can fire someone pretty much for no reason. So that's an adjustment I see people having to make. And then we'll get into this as well, I'm sure, but the whole issue about protecting your IP, I think that's one thing I think is people worry too much about. And I think it's probably weird for a lawyer to say that, but I do think that people do get quite worked up about that. But I think there's very practical steps that you can take to protect your IP, separating it, for example, what you actually bring in and what you bring in, only what you need to bring in, and so forth, and give people access that only really need access. So that would be my, high level tips starting out.
Yeah, and like you say, I mean, I guess you can divide it up into like legal, tax, commercial, all those kind of different areas. And I mean, if I'm talking with potential clients, the only major risk that they are all worried about in advance is that question of IP. And I think that there's kind of it's a bit of an urban myth in lots of ways that if you take your IP to China, you have no protection whatsoever.
Right.
And I've never quite understood why people see it like that. I'm not saying that it's an easy situation, but certainly in the last 15 years or so, it feels like you've got more chance of getting your IP protected properly,
Yeah.
and you've got the chance of buying it off somebody if they're squatting on your IP rights on. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, it depends. It depends what kind of IP you're talking about, right? So you mentioned just now like trademarks, right? So
yeah,
trademarks, there's a lot of squatters out there. They're usually just causing trouble to be bought off, right? Because China has a first to file system,
yeah,
which is also different from some other countries. It's more like first to use, but here in China, it's first to file, meaning someone can, as you know, the classic horror stories, right? Someone goes to a trade show, sees a brand, like, oh, that brand's probably coming to China. Let me register their mark first before they have a chance to. And then suddenly your brand is already owned by somebody else in China. So that's the one thing that obviously try and get a step ahead of. And then on patentable stuff or trade secrets, things like that. Um, the courts are, and this is also surprising to some people, the courts in major cities, first and maybe second tier cities, are quite advanced and professional and objective, and they even have specialized IP courts. So if you have the evidence you need to defend, to bring a claim or something like that, you will get a fair shake. Absolutely. Like that. These courts also tend to have internal metrics, KPIs that they have to that show that they're being balanced, and their own they're being watched, that they're not just some rogue judge who's always favoring local companies and so forth. Having said that, just to round it out on this question, the the trick is, like anywhere, but especially China, is you have to have evidence. And so the time and process to gather evidence and to have, quote, a smoking gun on IP theft or other kind of infringement is the real challenge. And that's true anywhere, but I think that's especially true in China. So I'd say, assuming you've got that down, which is maybe a big assumption, if you have your day in court, it is very fair and impartial.
yeah. And I think from the trademark perspective, it's let's say that is probably easier to prove
Yeah,
the theft of a trademark than it is in terms of like commercial secrets or anything that's been patented
right.
or some kind of new technology, those kind of things. And I understand that it's very difficult once it's out there. On the other hand, it's that question of once how many true trade secrets are there in lots of industries. The things that people see as being their trade secrets are actually much more general knowledge than they might think that they are.
Right. Yeah, and you can try and protect that through NDAs, right? You can try and say things are confidential information, but you're right. It's very hard to prove. And just going back to what we were talking about at the top, the best form of IP protection is not legal protection. It's actually, like we're saying, minimizing the actual access. You should assume that once it's out, it's very hard, even from a legal perspective, to again have a smoking gun. So the best thing you can do, like I've seen clients in the past be very, very careful about, when they bring machines in, having a very clear list, having it locked away, having someone in their trust manage a list of who, and clock in, clock out, who had access to this machine. um, and that's the best form of IP protection, more than anything you file anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, prevention is better than cure, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's always going to be the way around it. And how do you see this question of like localization? Because I think that that's also something that companies don't often realize. But
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, most trademarks, if you don't have it in Chinese characters, then you're also at risk of having your trademark effectively copied, borrowed, I don't know,
Yeah,
used.
there's the classic there's the classic case of the Michael Jordan brand, right? Where he was well known in China before he really came and ever did any try marketing or anything, and he was known as Chao Dan, right? And someone trademarked the Chinese version of his name, and that's true of any product, right?
Yep.
If your product name is difficult to say in Chinese and you haven't proactively come up with your own Chinese and filed a trademark, someone, the consumers might start to develop their own name for you, and someone entrepreneuring individual might then go register it, right? And the Jordan case was a classic example of that. So I think that's right to localize fast, localize in the sense of coming up with your own name and registering it, like you said. And I think localizing too, just in the people that you hire, right? To try and, as you get bigger, that's a bit more of a problem as you get bigger, right? That's the classic problem that a lot of bigger companies, Western companies, face, is how much do they localize the product and how much do they localize their team and the playbook and the decision-making process. And that's just a classic dilemma for the last 20 years or more, of how much the local team saying we don't have enough authorities to keep up with the China speed that
Yep.
everybody talks about, and the management saying we have a global standard, that's not how we do things. And it's just I experienced it myself when I was in-house. It's a constant tension that's there.
Yeah. I mean, you have that tension in pretty much any market, but in China, it's especially present, I would say, simply because you have that kind of, firstly, the ecosystem that you're working in is somehow separated from the rest of the world, be it in marketing or often sales channels and so on, are completely different. And so, whilst you might have the same situation in, I don't know, Norway or something like that, because there's more similarities, it doesn't feel quite as bad. And because you may be in a similar time zone, whereas China is completely different time zone, you've got all of those kind of smaller factors that each one on their own isn't that drastic, but then they all kind of play together, don't they, and just make it into a difficult situation for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, there's really no right answer about the question of how much do you localize. I mean, every company's different, every product's different, but you definitely can't run China remotely, and not give your team any authority at all, because you're just going to always be a step behind.
Yeah. And I think that you're always going to be in that situation of getting, let's say you damage your reputation by simply being too slow and by being too old fashioned, if you like,
Yeah.
because you're not adapted to the Chinese way of doing things, be it customer service or dealing with issues that blow up on overnight.
And the
So
ironic thing is when you move back, well, I guess you've always been back and forth, but like us, when we move back, you're suddenly you're going from a fast pace to a slow pace, and you're like, oh, okay, you have to reset your expectations. But living in China, consumers definitely have an expectation of kind of instant
yeah,
demand, delivery and everything.
yeah, and that kind of instant gratification and instant answers 24/7 if you have questions to things or if something goes wrong. I mean, that's also a topic.
Mm.
And so, what would you say were the most common problems around risk that you've seen companies get themselves into when they've been in China? Is it around contracts or is it around getting their money out when they've got like some kind of legal entity in China?
Yeah, I think there's some of them we've touched a bit on before already. I think one additional one is keeping control of your chops, your seals for the company.
Yep.
We've seen some horror stories with that. Of course, maybe a little dear to your heart, the British company Arm had that saga with their rogue CEO who literally had the chop locked up in his personal safe and was refusing to leave the office if he was terminated. So that's a bit of an extreme case, but for sure, I mean, as you know, Kathryn, in China, you can execute a contract simply by applying CHOP. It doesn't matter no one even needs to sign the contract from the company's perspective. The CHOP in and of itself is
Yep.
legally binding.
I used to
Um,
carry them to and fro. So,
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's very important who has access to them, and both from executing contracts, but sometimes, as I was mentioning, in that case, even more importantly, for changing legal documents or governing documents with the company, right? Like who's the legal representative, for example, of the company. You need the CHOP to change that out, and if you don't have the CHOP, you're kind of stuck in no man's land with trying to get this process done from a bureaucracy perspective with the government. So I would say the one thing that's overlooked the most is chops. We often advocate also to separate bank account access. So there are companies that you can use that will, like a third party that will help you, store the chops and give access to the chops under your instructions. Same with bank account access. So because all these things do need to be local, right? You need to have local bank accounts especially because, as you know, the currency, the RMB is local and it's staying local, and everything, capital coming in or money going out, has to be exchanged. I think that's probably the one other thing I would highlight for your question is whether you're in China with your business or you're doing cross border. People underestimate the havoc that the RMB plays in things, because it's not a freely convertible currency, and it kind of rears its ugly head in all places, from how long you need to give on payment terms to your counterparty if they don't already have US dollars or some foreign currency in a foreign bank to pay you. There's
Hmm.
lead time for that, to get money out, approved by their bank, to all kinds of things, to equity investments. The State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which governs the currency regulations and foreign exchange, is a very, very difficult agency to understand and deal with, and is just not user friendly. And therefore, anytime we deal with regulations that SAFE puts out, we're just like, oh boy, here we go again, because they have a very broad mandate they regulate foreign exchange, but they take that as a very broad mandate to stick their hands in a lot of different buckets.
Yeah.
And so that's just something to be aware of, the timing of issues around foreign exchange.
And I think in the past, it also was an issue for, at least for like small and medium-sized companies, it was an issue if they needed to, get credit in order to pay their foreign partners. It wasn't
Mhm.
that easy for them to actually do larger financial raises. I mean, that changed over time, but certainly at one time it was quite difficult for them as a privately owned company
Mhm.
to actually get access to financing to pay their overseas bills, because the bank was so restrictive about allowing them to do conversions.
Yeah, the bank is going to need to see. That's the thing. So you need to be ready, right? The bank is going to need to see the contract. It's
Yep.
going to most likely need to see at least a reference translation of the contract. So you could draft your contract in English, but you're going to need a Chinese version. Now, I mean, might not be the version that you sign. It might not have the same legal effect as the English version, but your counterparty in China is going to need a Chinese version
Yep.
to go to the bank and say, look, I need to make a payment under this clause, the payment terms, and it's just not some bogus transaction of me trying to get money out of China. It's a legitimate commercial transaction. Here's the seller and so forth, and you got to go through that. You got to go through that process. They're going to need a Chinese version of the contract.
Yeah. I mean, so what would be the other kind of points where you would say, okay, you have to really take care of these when you're doing contracts for China? For example, for me, a lot of the companies I work with, they're working with a distribution partner, and
Mm-hmm.
when they start out, that they can they assume that their standard contract that they're using in almost everywhere else, that will work in China. They assume that it'll be enforceable in China, and that that they can agree that they're going to have German law or something, or UK law, and that they can have a court case that runs in, I don't know, London or Munich or Berlin or something like that, and it'll
Right.
be dead easy to just enforce it, the same as it would be with any other contract.
Yeah, that's a risky assumption. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so There's a couple things there. I mean, one, it depends a bit on who the counterparty is. If it's a local, like a local distributor, right? They only have a presence in China,
Yeah.
and like you said, you have a contract with them that's cross border, but you want the governing law to be Germany, and you want dispute resolution in Germany or something like that. I mean, if something goes wrong, your counterparty in China is going to say, okay, go ahead, sue me in Germany. I'm not going to show up, right? It's good luck. And so you've got a judgment in Germany, but then you've got to try and get that judgment enforced. And that's where it can get complicated, especially, for example, in contracts, you usually have the choice of either having disputes in courts or dispute resolution by arbitration.
Yeah.
If you choose arbitration, you at least have a path to getting the award enforced in China through the New York Convention on Enforcement of Arbitration Awards, which China is a party to. And so you get a valid arbitration award in almost any country outside of China. You can take that to a court in China. It does take time and money to do this, but you can get that authenticated and validated and then enforced in China. If, on the other hand, you have a foreign court judgment, especially in a place like the United States and China do not have a treaty that recognizes each other's court judgments. So you could have a judgment, you could win, however, on the merits, or the Chinese counterparty just doesn't show up and you win by default. But you've got a judgment, but you have nothing. And if they don't have assets in the US or anywhere outside of China, it's a worthless judgment. It's meaningless because there's no mechanism to get it enforced in China, and there's no assets to get at in another country that will recognize the judgment. So you're kind of left with no recourse. And so that's something, like you said, somebody comes with a beautiful template. I want dispute resolution in Santa Clara, California, which you see a lot of Silicon Valley companies doing, or you see something in Germany or wherever. You have your perfect contract. The other party didn't touch it. That's also something to be aware of. If the other party doesn't even make any comments on your contract, then that's usually a bad sign as well. But yeah,
that means they've not read it. I mean,
right. And
let's
they don't
be honest,
they don't care.
Read it.
And they know that what we would call judgment proof, right? They know that you're going to get a judgment somewhere else, but you're not going to have any ability to enforce it against them.
And how about, have you worked with any cases that have gone to arbitration, for example, in Shanghai? Because I know you can agree. I've never had a case with any of my clients or with any of the companies I've worked for in the past, but I know that you can agree an arbitration court in Shanghai in English, but I was never sure whether it's also one of those things. It's nice on paper, but in practice.
No, I know several arbitrators in Shanghai. I mean, they're very professional, and they're very impartial, and that can be a good choice. Maybe just to finish up the thought from before, to connect it with this. So don't have dispute resolution in Germany or the US, and especially not in a court. If you're going to do that, have at least arbitration. But then if you've got instead, then you should choose, and this is also kind of counterintuitive, you should choose dispute resolution in China. And people are like, why am I giving them the home court advantage, right? Well, the reality is, again, you're going to ultimately need the judgment to be enforced in China anyway.
Yep.
And going back to what we said before, the courts these days, especially if you're choosing which city to bring it in, like Shanghai, which is very international and the courts are very professional, versus somebody else, letting them pick their home court in Anhui, or, no offense to Anhui, but you know what I mean. And good luck with that, finding someone that can speak English or any. So you should proactively select, courts in Shanghai or arbitration in Shanghai. And I go back and forth on this. I've often advocated courts because it's very direct, and there's no second step. Like, even if you get an arbitration award, you need the court's help to enforce it anyway. So why not just go straight to the court? They're very professional. But what I've seen in the last couple of years, and maybe it's because the number of disputes just keeps going up, whether it's Chinese or foreign versus Chinese. But I've noticed with my clients, there's more and more of a backlog. So it's not that anyone's being unfair. It's just the courts just seem to be perpetually understaffed. So that's been extremely frustrating for clients in the last year or so. So that's something I think also to be cognizant of. I think my own advice would change from the past. I think I'd almost recommend arbitration at this point in China, because you're going to be able to get your day in court a lot sooner.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard different recommendations from different people, like you say, which is why I always like to ask, would you recommend arbitration in China or outside China? And I think it's one of those things that I think a lot of companies, they skip talking in detail with their overseas partners. It's not just a China thing at the beginning of a relationship, because it feels counterintuitive to talk about how are we going to end this relationship when we haven't actually started it formally. And there are some countries, I mean, the US as a culture tends to have, let's say, a different approach to legalities than
We
Europeans.
have more lawyers per
Slow
capita
to
than any country
sue,
in the
or
world.
yeah, who tend to be slow to sue, or tend to be, you wouldn't go to court in Europe unless you really had to with a partner. And I think that a lot of companies are a little bit shy of going and saying, look, these are the terms that we want to have, and if something goes wrong. But at the end of the day, I've always seen it that beginning, that kind of honeymoon period when you're still, going out for lunch and for dinner with the guys, and everything's going forward because you're just starting everything, that is exactly the time when you can talk about those difficult things, isn't it? When it's, and if somebody's going to be offended by it, then maybe you need to consider if you're working with the right partner.
I think that's a great point. If someone is offended by you having a contract that you want to go through with and talk about how they relate, talk about how the relationship would potentially wind up and terminate, and how disputes would be resolved. I mean, you don't necessarily, like, the business people don't necessarily want to go through all those details right away, but it's appropriate to have a conversation, about the contract. And if a Chinese your Chinese counterparty is balking at that or doesn't like that, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, it is kind of like antithetical to Chinese business culture to talk about that stuff. But on the other hand, a sophisticated Chinese company that is used to doing global business should have adapted to that already. And the fact that they still have kind of a knee-jerk reaction of not wanting to talk about is actually more of a sign that they're not as sophisticated as you thought they were, and they're not as well versed in international kind of business norms as you might have thought. And that's kind of can be its own kind of signal in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at the end of the day, nobody really, apart from maybe lawyers, I don't want to be rude to, I can't be rude to lawyers today because,
Okay, we're used to it.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
I mean, at the end of the day, nobody really enjoys going through however many pages of a contract, do they?
Right.
And talking about the nuance of whether this Chinese version is really the correct translation
Right.
of the English or the German original or whatever it happens to be. But it's one of those things that, okay, that is just a fact of life that you have to do if you want to have a strong foundation for your business.
Yeah.
And that's just if you're going in for like the light version and just working with a distribution partner. If you're going in and if you're founding some kind of legal entity, be it a WFOE or anything else, be it a joint venture, whatever, then there's going to be a lot more work in the contracts to make sure that everything is watertight.
Yeah.
Than you're going to have with a distribution partner, probably.
Yeah. And I mean, a couple of things to say on that point, like any contract that's like complicated at all as far as the relationship, right? It's not just kind of a one-off purchase of something. You should put together a term sheet, right? I agree with you. I wouldn't expect someone to, especially right in the beginning, to go through all the details of a contract, but you should put in the key terms and not just rely on some discussion you had and some handshake you had, and okay, now the lawyers will put it in the contract. And because chances are something gets lost in translation or lost in the handoff between what you discussed and what was put in the contract. And so what is good is to have like a one page, doesn't have to be a LOI or a term sheet or anything with a header on it. It can just be in an email. But I find more and more with clients, not just Chinese, not just doing business in China, but in general, but especially I think for China, put the key terms in writing and send it to the other side to confirm so that there's no misunderstanding. And that doesn't take a Herculean effort to review like it would a 20-page or 30-page contract. So I think that's a key step that's often skipped over between a business discussion and then one side sending their form contract over.
Yeah, and it's something that you can do. I mean, like for me, coming from the commercial side of things, it means that if I send over what are the main cornerstones of our discussion, what are the payment terms, what are the delivery terms, all those kind of basics, as it were, then if I'm sending that across in an email, I'm putting it in language that is very straightforward commercial language. It's not tied up in formal legal language that for a language learner is going to be more difficult to understand. Have I really understood that properly? But if I've got something that at least, even if it doesn't hold water from a legal perspective, at least it shows that the person I'm talking to is saying to me, okay, this is the payment term, this is the delivery term, this is what you need to do when you want to place an order.
Yeah.
This is what we will do.
And it's also very helpful later on if you have a dispute, whether it's an informal dispute or a formal dispute, right? You don't want them to say, well, you sent me a 30-page contract in English. Do you really is it reasonable to assume that I went through every last detail of it, right? I'm a busy guy, or whatever. We're doing all kinds of orders. But if you've got something concrete in an email or a one-page document you sign or initial or whatever, it's not such a convenient excuse anymore for that.
Yeah. It's good to have things as clear as possible.
Yeah.
Easy, just to make it easier.
I'll always support that.
Yeah. I mean, I just certain think there's no point making things more complicated than they have to be. But you do have to protect both sides' interests, don't you? And
yeah, absolutely. And even in China, again, it's not you even don't put these contracts together with the idea that you're gonna really enforce it, because I want to reiterate, there's actually a threshold, right? I mean, the cost of litigation anywhere is expensive. The cost of litigation in China is expensive because not so much all the lawyer fees you're going to have to pay, but more so just the time of
because it's on
getting
the other side
evidence
of the world. Yeah.
translated into, yes, collecting it, getting it translated, getting it sometimes off, if it's overseas documents, getting it authenticated at the Chinese embassy. And so this is like a very long process. So if you've got a dispute for $50,000 or $100,000 of this, a small dispute, don't bother, right? You're not going to bring a case for that amount. So know that going into it. And the point, and even for higher value contracts, the point of the contract is not necessarily that you're actually going to take it to court someday, but it's still there. Anytime you have a dispute, of course, 98% of the time or whatever, it's going to get worked out, negotiated, some compromise is going to happen. But even for, we always joke, Chinese people don't read the contract. They just, renegotiate later. That's an old joke, which is not true anymore. But my point is, the contract, even for Chinese and Chinese dispute, right? Chinese company versus Chinese company, the contract is still the starting point of where we negotiate from. So that even if you think in the back of your mind, we're never going to be able to actually enforce this or whatever, it still has value as a starting point in negotiations.
It's not just that, it's a kind of a sign of good faith, isn't it? Because it doesn't just give you the obligations, it also gives you your rights and helps both sides just straighten out what's expected of me, realistically speaking.
Right.
For that. And I mean, maybe just to move on to the idea of if you have something like a WFOE in China, you mentioned earlier this question of employment contracts. I mean, I would say that actually employing staff in China is a little bit, it has a lot of similarities to employing staff in former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe. You know, the formalities that you need to go through, that you need to have an employee handbook, that you need to
Right.
have, that you need to document that there's certain things that you need to allow for, like lunch allowances and all of these kind of things. And I think that there's a bigger gap there in employment law between Europe generally
Mm.
and let's say there's a bigger gap between Europe and China and then the US.
Yeah.
Like Europe and China are probably closer on that
Yeah.
topic, I think, than the US and China.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so the Gulf, as I typically work with more American clients, the gap is bigger, so that's always fun. But yeah, I mean, things changed quite a lot way back in 2008 when the labor contract law came in, and it really modeled itself on employment laws in Europe. It definitely did not borrow from the U.S. And so there are very discrete reasons that you have to have. You have to have one of those reasons to be able to terminate an employee.
Yep.
And things like redundancy or even poor performance is not explicitly in those reasons. And so for example, you need to show, if you're going to terminate someone because they're not doing a good job, you need to give them multiple warnings. You need to give them training opportunities to
Hmm.
improve, which is kind of like a futile exercise, right? But there's a process you have to go through, and you have to document. A lot of times companies, you know, if they're not used to China, they just give people, like they have the rate, like a great, like well above average, or like performing at level, or like whatever. But in the a typical American or European style, where we like to be polite to people, we give them a rating even though they're well below performing where they should be performing. We still help them save face and give them a rating that's like, needs improvement or something like that, right?
Hmm.
Well, then when you actually have to say that they're a horrible performer, you say, well, you gave them a contract that said they just need improvement.
Yep.
So, so careful what you wish for in that sense. The courts in China, first, the labor arbitration is the first step of a dispute, and then if you can appeal as a company or as an employee to a court. But they're very supportive of employees. They are now not to the extreme. It's not like they're supportive at all costs. There there are there are plenty of cases where the courts say, or the labor arbitration says, this employee is just clearly being unreasonable, right? And so they will not blindly take the employee's side of a dispute all the time, and they'll typically help the companies try to come to some settlement. And so so that's gotten a lot better. But yeah, I mean, you got to be careful to have a handbook. The reason to have the handbook is so that you have rules. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But the handbook has to say, you need to be to work on time, and the time is from 9 to 5, right?
Hmm.
If you don't have that, somebody always shows up at 10 o'clock. You can't. There's no. Well, it doesn't say in my employment contract that I have to be here at 9. It doesn't say in that. Where does it say that? So it's kind of silly, but it's an exercise you have to go through.
Yeah. Where does it say that I have to ask you if I'm going to take a day off or
Right.
all those kind of all those kind of little things, as it were, that are not so little when you stand there and you need somebody and they're not in the office maybe.
Right. Yeah. So I've written a whole article about this at least a couple of times. Having an employee handbook is your best friend as
Yep.
a HR staff. You think it's annoying at first, but trust me, you're going to need it.
And at the end of the day, realistically speaking, it's like any other kind of let's say work document that you might have. You can get templated ones that you then
Mhm.
just adjust to your individual situation, can't you? So
Right. Right. Yeah.
not,
Like we have standard templates. You don't need to tweak too much in them usually.
yeah, that's true. they're not. And I mean, the things that I think we used to have discussions about with things like um, travel expenses, you know, that
Mhm.
often between the differences between if somebody was working in a Chinese company, if they went on a business trip to somewhere like tier 3, tier 4, and they would stay in some, let's say, scummy hotel, they would stay somewhere that was like really, yeah, not international standards, let's say.
Mhm.
Um, and then you have an employment handbook that says that if they stay in this level of city, then they can spend this budget. And then suddenly they're traveling with one of the company owners who wants to stay in an international five-star hotel, and they're like, yeah, how do I manage my budgets? I mean, it
Right.
they're all just little things, and of course it's nothing that you can't solve with discussion. But sometimes I think for Chinese stuff, they get into a little bit of a panic because they feel like, oh, you know, my handbook says one thing, but the expectation and the reality is actually something different. And I think
Yeah.
that that's something that in Europe, it would just be, okay, great. If I'm traveling with senior management, then I get to stay in a better hotel than if I'm just traveling on my own budget, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but sometimes people get upset about those things. So,
Yeah. And I think that goes to a bigger point that I think in general, you need to have more visibility into who your vendors are in China because there's less of a culture of kind of whistleblowing and that sort of thing. So it's unfortunately, I would say a little more common to have someone in procurement or someone making purchasing decisions for the local woofie in China, having relationships with some supplier or vendor that's maybe even a family member. And so you don't know if these are arm's length relationships or not, and how the pricing is negotiated or not negotiated at all, or
mhm,
how it works, how the procurement process works. And that's not something necessarily that kind of thing comes out when there's some other trouble at the company. So that's the kind of stuff that stays under the surface until something else goes wrong, and then it all comes up to the surface all at once. So, and you're like, where did all this come from? Well, it was always there. It's just there was no triggering
yeah,
factor before. Yeah.
yeah,
So that's just something to be aware of. Just try to have visibility into the vendors that you use locally.
yeah. And I think that this kind of question of transparency and compliance is one that people, how should I say, people do worry about it a lot, and it is a topic that's difficult to get full transparency on in any market where you as a company don't actually speak the language of
Yeah.
the market that you're selling in, because it's very difficult to really get that full view into what is going on in all of those discussions.
Yeah. I've seen, and again, I'm trying not to paint stereotypes, but I've seen a lot of companies where the local general manager has a very tight grip over the team in China, and including kind of access to information,
Yep.
um, and so where are these problems? You don't hear about these problems until that GM leaves, right? And then some new GM comes in, assuming they weren't promoted from within, or there's some other axe to grind, right? And then you hear about these problems. But um, the this oftentimes when companies go over and visit their local subsidiary in China, right? They'll spend time with the GM, they'll spend time with the local finance person, right, or HR person or something, and that's about it. And I'm not saying all people are kind of working in conjunction with each other, but if you're only seeing the same one or two people every time you go and visit your company, you're probably not getting the full picture of
Yeah.
what's happening in your company. So,
And that's not necessarily that people are doing that in bad faith.
right.
It's just if you only talk to if you only talk to 2 people in your own company, then you're also not going to have a full picture of what's going on. And especially if there's that culture of people being afraid of speaking up if there are problems and so on, which often, of course, comes up in Asia across the board, because people don't want to lose face, or they don't want to cause their boss to lose face. And yeah, it happens.
Yeah. Yep. It's true outside of China as well, but it's just something I've seen over the years.
Yeah. No, I mean, I see it a lot across Asia. And sometimes the places where I've seen it worst, if you like, are places like Singapore or Hong Kong, simply because whichever company is the principal in Europe, usually in my case, when they go to Singapore or Hong Kong, because people speak such good English, and because people seem very they seem very cosmopolitan, and they seem very either European or American, because often they've been educated in the UK or in the US. So it feels like they're they have the same mentality, but actually at the end of the day, it's an Asian culture. And I think those are the things where I've seen several cases, not always my clients, but from friends and so on, where you see something then come up that actually should have been spoken about much earlier than it was. And like you say, it doesn't come up until the whole thing starts to unravel.
Yeah.
And then all of the dirt swims to the surface, more or less. So
I 100% agree. There's no correlation between your level of English proficiency and your level of trustworthiness.
yeah.
Those are unrelated, completely unrelated to the
Or
two.
intelligence. That's the
Yeah,
other
or
one that's
intelligence. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah, that
completely
often
agree.
comes up. And do American companies struggle with all of this kind of this PIPL law? Because I mean, for Europeans, it's very much like it's almost the same as a GDPR. Most of the main clauses are quite based on
Yeah,
German interpretation of GDPR, if we're being honest. But I think the US doesn't really have anything that's quite the same in this kind of data security regulations, do they?
right. No, they don't. California has, and more states are having state laws. California's law is the most widespread because so many companies do business in California in one way, shape, or form. But no, it doesn't, and I don't think it's going to get one anytime soon. But you're right. China did model PIPL on GDPR in Europe. Conceptually, it's very similar. I mean, it's still, even to today, 4 years later, it's still very much a work in progress. As far as how it actually is being implemented. I still give my clients advice that, there's going to be things about it that are incomplete and unclear and confusing. You just have to make a good faith effort to comply. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist, or it's like, oh, well, they're still figuring out how to enforce it. You have to do as best you can. But the flip side of that is you're not going to be slapped on the wrist, or you're not going to be,
You're not going to be nailed down on it completely, are you?
yes,
Because they don't
yes,
know themselves how to execute. So
right. And this is a bigger point, which I think probably maybe is worth noting, especially since we've been kind of saying how risky China is for the last 50 minutes.
yeah,
China is, anyways, is still a great place to do business, in the sense that the Chinese authorities have these rules, but that doesn't mean that they literally enforce them down to the letter of the rules. The rules themselves are unclear. It gives discretion, but it also doesn't mean that they use that discretion in a negative way just by default. And if any, I mean, China is still very welcoming to foreign investment. Maybe in a lot of ways, it really needs it right now. And
yeah.
so, there's a lot of times I tell clients, there are rules about hosting businesses on the cloud in China,
Hmm.
right? Whether you need an ICP license or something like that. It's very vague. It's deliberately vague because the technology is changing so fast. So and it's not like, and people are like, oh, they hear, people kind of whispering in their ears, if you don't have an ICP license, your business is going to get shut down and all that. That's not true at all.
No.
The government does not want to just, it's not like somebody from MIT that regulates this is going around the internet and looking at different sites and say, okay, they look like they have an ICP business, but they don't have an ICP license. Nobody's doing that.
Nobody
Yes,
has
your
time for that.
nobody has
I
time for
mean,
that. Now, maybe your competitor might say, look at those guys, right? But you're going to be given a chance to rectify the situation, because China doesn't want to shut businesses down unless they're doing something truly egregious, right? Um, so if it's a corner case, if it's a gray area, their first instinct is not to shut down the business. It's to say, look, you need to fix this, and you can go back and say, look, we looked at this. We hired a law firm. We looked at the risk. This is what we've done. If you just got to show the good faith effort.
yeah, and I think that that's a good point for us to stop at for me this evening and for you this morning, and to say, I think we would agree China is open for business. China wants to do business, but like anywhere else, you should use your good judgment and get some good advice as to what the risks are of your individual business. I mean, go into that. And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I can't give anybody legal advice, but I think a lot of the time, if you go in with common sense, then chances are that China will be a good option for you if
Yeah.
you're commercially viable.
Yeah.
Art, thank you so much for taking the time
Yeah.
today to talk with me. Who should, if somebody is watching this, I'm hoping that this is visible and that maybe for the replay there'll be a little bit more response. But if anybody's looking at this later in time, who should reach out to you if they're thinking that they need some advice? Who would be like the kind of people that you help usually?
Yeah. I mean, we help companies across all different sectors, foreign companies doing business in China, whether it's directly with a setting up a WFOE that we talked about, or just having trading relationship, sourcing from China. We help them with those contracts, with disputes, and yeah, I mean, my own expertise is a little bit more on the tech side, so semiconductor
Mhm.
and SaaS software is tend to be the bread and butter clients that I have. But we work across. We've got 3 other lawyers on the team. They all speak Mandarin, and so we help clients across the board.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And hopefully, business between the US and China will be picking up at some point soon. Would be good.
Hope so.
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, well, thank you very much. And we will leave it there. And thank you to everybody who's listening.
Thank you, everybody.